The GoPro lens was cracked in 3 places when they found it sitting on the red sandstone like someone had placed it there on purpose. Dakari Voss had crawled into the cave 72 hours earlier with that same camera strapped to his chest, joking about getting 1 million views for squeezing through a hole barely wider than his shoulders. The device that documented his final moments lay clean and dry outside the entrance to Devil's Throat Cave in Utah's remote Pariah Canyon, while inside that same cave, rescue teams had crawled through 8 miles of tunnels without finding a single trace of the 19-year-old who went in laughing and never came out. This was the kid who once got 2 million views for pretending to be stuck in a McDonald's Play Place tunnel. Dakari Voss had built his entire online presence around cramming his 6-foot frame into impossible spaces and filming the results. His YouTube channel, Squeeze Challenge, had 400,000 subscribers who couldn't get enough of watching him wedge himself into dry vents, storm drains, and abandoned mine shafts across the American Southwest. He'd never met a tight space he wouldn't explore, never found a cave system that scared him, never encountered a challenge that didn't end with him emerging victorious and covered in dirt, ready to edit another viral video. But Devil's Throat Cave wasn't just another content opportunity waiting to happen. This particular cave system had swallowed 7 people in the past 30 years, and not one of them had ever been recovered. The morning of October 15, 2021, Dakari and his 3 friends had hiked 14 miles into Pariah Canyon looking for what he called epic content locations. The canyon stretched like a wound through southern Utah, its walls rising 800 feet on either side and creating shadows so deep that noon felt like dusk. They'd been camping rough for 4 days, surviving on energy bars and creek water when friend Maddox Chen spotted something that made him stop walking. A hole in the canyon wall about 3 feet high and 18 inches wide gaped like a mouth carved into the red rock. The opening looked perfectly round, too perfect to be natural, with smooth edges that seemed almost polished. Local Navajo guides called it Devil's Throat because sounds that went in never came back out. But the 4 college students from Phoenix didn't know that. They just saw a cave that looked tailor-made for Dakari's particular brand of internet fame. "Dude, imagine the views," Dakari said, already pulling his camera gear from his backpack. He'd brought 3 GoPros on this trip, along with LED light strips and a wireless microphone that could broadcast from inside tight spaces. The setup had cost him $8,000, paid for entirely by his YouTube ad revenue. Nobody's ever filmed inside something this narrow. "This is exactly what we came out here for." His friends weren't so sure. The cave opening sat about 20 feet above the canyon floor, requiring a scramble up loose scree and brittle sandstone to reach. Worse, the hole seemed to angle downward immediately, disappearing into blackness that their flashlights couldn't penetrate when they dropped a rock through the opening. They counted 12 seconds before hearing it hit something solid. But Dakari was already clipping the GoPro to his chest harness and threading the LED strip through his belt loops. He'd done this exact routine hundreds of times before. The only difference was that usually he performed this ritual in abandoned buildings or storm drains with multiple exit points. Devil's Throat Cave had exactly one way in and one way out, through that 18-inch gap in the canyon wall. "If I'm not back in 2 hours, call the Rangers," he joked, switching on the camera and giving his signature thumbs up to the lens. But let's be real, when have I ever not made it back? The last footage anyone would see of Dakari Voss alive showed him squeezing through that opening at 2:47 p.m., his LED lights creating a pale glow that quickly vanished into the cave's depths. His wireless microphone continued transmitting for another 6 minutes, sending back the sound of his breathing and occasional comments about the cave's insane acoustics and perfect filming conditions. Then the signal went dead. At first, his friends assumed the wireless range had simply been exceeded. Caves were notorious for killing radio signals, and Dakari had probably crawled beyond the transmitter's 500-foot range. They settled into wait, taking turns calling his name into the cave opening and listening for responses that never came. 2 hours passed then, for by sunset, Maddox was hiking back toward the main trail to get cell phone reception and call for help. The other 2 friends, Zara Okafor and Finn McCarthy, spent the night taking turns shouting into Devil's Throat Cave and listening to their voices disappear into silence. The rescue operation began at dawn on October 16th with a team of 8 specialists from Utah's Technical Rescue Unit. These were people who made their living crawling into impossible spaces to retrieve victims of cave-ins, flash floods, and climbing accidents. They'd pulled bodies from crevices 18 inches wide and tunnels that twisted like corkscrews through solid rock. But Devil's Throat Cave tested every skill they'd ever learned. The opening led to a vertical shaft that dropped 40 feet before leveling out into a horizontal tunnel barely 2 feet high. That tunnel continued for 200 feet before branching into 3 separate passages, each one narrower than the last. The main passage dead-ended after another 300 feet. The left branch opened into a cavern the size of a school bus, completely empty, except for scattered animal bones that looked decades old. The right branch kept going. For 3 days, rescue teams crawled through every inch of accessible cave system. They mapped tunnels that twisted and branched like the roots of some enormous underground tree, They found passages so narrow they had to exhale completely to squeeze through. Chambers so low they had to army crawl for hundreds of yards at a time. Dead ends that came without warning after hours of difficult progress. They found zero trace of Dakari Voss. No torn clothing on sharp rocks, no scuff marks from his boots, no lost equipment or emergency supplies. The lead strip he'd been wearing should have lit up every passage he traveled, but the rescue teams found no evidence he'd ever been in any of the tunnels they explored. It was as if he'd vanished the moment he passed through that opening. On the morning of October 18th, exactly 72 hours after Dakari entered the cave, rescue coordinator Janet Pike was leading her fourth sweep of the main tunnel when she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The passage ahead of her, a section she'd crawled through 6 times in the past 3 days, had changed. The tunnel was wider, not by much, maybe 6 inches. But Pike had been exploring caves for 23 years, and she knew the difference between a passage that barely accommodated her shoulders and one where she could move her arms freely. This section of tunnel had definitely been narrower 2 days ago. Stone doesn't reshape itself overnight. That's when she started backing out of the cave as fast as the narrow space would allow. Pike reached the surface just as Finn McCarthy came running up the scree slope, holding something in his hands and shouting about finding it on the ground near the cave entrance. The GoPro that Dakari had been wearing when he entered Devil's Throat Cave sat in Finn's palm like evidence from a crime scene that made no sense. The camera looked like it had been sitting outside for months instead of hours. Desert sand had worked its way into every crevice. The lens was spiderwebbed with cracks that formed a pattern too geometric to be random. The metal casing showed deep scratches that looked almost deliberate, like someone had dragged a knife across the surface in careful parallel lines. But the camera still worked. Pike connected the GoPro to her laptop right there on the canyon floor, with Dakari's 3 friends crowding around to watch footage that would haunt every person who saw it. The first 47 minutes showed exactly what they expected: Dakari squeezing through the cave opening, sliding down the vertical shaft, crawling through the horizontal tunnel with his LED lights, creating a bubble of illumination in the absolute darkness. He was talking constantly, keeping up the running commentary that made his videos so popular. "This is definitely the tightest space I've ever been in," he said at the 20-minute mark, his voice slightly strained from the physical effort of crawling. "But the acoustics in here are incredible. Every sound I make comes back different, like there's something changing it." At the 32-minute mark, he reached the branching point where the tunnel split into 3 passages. Without hesitation, he chose the right branch, the one that rescue teams had found too narrow to explore fully. "This passage keeps going," he told the camera. "I can feel air moving, which means there's another opening somewhere ahead. This could be the discovery of a lifetime." The footage continued for another 15 minutes, showing Dakari crawling through spaces so tight his shoulders scraped both walls simultaneously. His breathing grew more labored, but his enthusiasm never wavered. He was convinced he was about to find something spectacular, some hidden chamber or underground lake that would make this the most viral video of his career. Then, at the 47-minute mark, he stopped moving, not because he'd reached a dead end or gotten stuck. He simply stopped crawling and lay still in the tunnel, his lights creating a small sphere of visibility in the darkness ahead. For 30 seconds he didn't speak or move. The only sound was his breathing, which had suddenly become quick and shallow. "Did you hear that?" he whispered finally. The microphone picked up nothing except his own voice and the barely audible sound of air moving through the cave system. But Dakari was listening to something, his head turned slightly to the left as if tracking a sound coming from deeper in the cave. "There's someone else down here," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. That's when the footage began to change in ways that made no logical sense. The video quality started degrading, as if the camera was losing power, but the battery indicators showed 90% charge. The LED lights flickered erratically, creating strobe effects that made the tunnel walls seem to pulse and shift. Strange shadows appeared in the footage, moving independently of any light source, sliding along the cave walls like living things. Dakari's breathing became rapid and panicked. "I need to get out of here," he said. But instead of turning around, he kept crawling forward, deeper into the cave system. The camera showed him moving through passages that seemed to widen and narrow without warning, spaces that defied the basic laws of geology. "I can't find the way back," he said at the 51-minute mark. "The tunnel behind me is gone. It's just solid rock now." The final 12 minutes of footage showed Dakari crawling through spaces that didn't match any part of the cave system the rescue teams had mapped. He moved through chambers with impossible geometries, tunnels that seemed to bend back on themselves, passages where the walls appeared to breathe like living tissue. His final words, recorded at the 63-minute mark, were barely audible. Above the sound of his sobbing, "It's not a cave. It's something else, and it's been waiting." The footage ended abruptly with the screen going completely black, but the audio continued for another 17 seconds. In that silence, viewers could hear something that made Janet Pike delete the file immediately after watching it once. a sound like laughter, but coming from multiple directions at once, as if the cave itself was amused by what had just happened. The official rescue report listed Dakari Voss as missing, presumed dead due to cave-in or getting lost in unexplored passages. The report mentioned that the cave system was more extensive than initially believed and that several passages were too dangerous for rescue teams to fully explore. It made no mention of the footage found on his camera or the impossible changes with to the tunnel system that Pike had observed. The GoPro was returned to Dakari's family, who donated it to a geology department at the University of Utah. The camera disappeared from the university's equipment inventory 3 weeks later, and no one could explain how or why. Devil's Throat Cave was sealed with concrete and steel barriers 6 months after Dakari's disappearance, officially due to ongoing geological instability that poses extreme danger to recreational cavers. The real reason was that more people had vanished while attempting to explore passages that shouldn't have existed, passages that kept appearing in new locations each time survey teams tried to map them. The last person to see Dakari Voss alive was Maddox Chen, who still insists that his friend's final YouTube video was uploaded automatically from his phone 3 days after he disappeared. The video showed Dakari sitting in what looked like a vast underground chamber, speaking directly to the camera with perfect audio quality despite being miles underground. "If you're watching this," Dakari said in footage that shouldn't have been possible to record or upload, "don't come looking for me. I found something down here, but it's not what I thought it was. The cave doesn't just go into the earth, it goes somewhere else entirely." The video was deleted by YouTube's automated systems within hours for violating community guidelines, but not before 50,000 people had watched it and began planning their own expeditions to Paria Canyon. The YouTube video that shouldn't have existed was just the beginning of what happened next. Within 6 hours of its brief appearance online, 47 people had downloaded copies before the automatic deletion. These weren't random viewers, they were urban explorers, cave diving enthusiasts, and content creators who specialized in extreme locations. The footage of Dakari sitting in that impossible underground chamber had shown something in the background that made experienced cavers pack their gear immediately. Behind Dakari's left shoulder, barely visible in the camera's light, stretched what looked like a tunnel system carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. The walls showed markings that looked almost like writing, symbols that curved and twisted in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But what made the footage truly irresistible to viewers was the sound. Throughout the 3-minute video, a low humming could be heard in the background, so quiet that most people missed it on first viewing. Audio analysis revealed the sound was coming from multiple sources, creating harmonics that suggested a vast network of connected spaces all resonating at the same frequency. The sound was identical to recordings made in other cave systems across the Southwest, caves that had also been sealed after unexplained disappearances. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geologist from the University of New Mexico, had been studying these acoustic anomalies for 8 years when Dakari's footage surfaced. She'd documented identical sounds in caves across Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado, always in systems where people had vanished without trace. The humming always preceded disappearances, by exactly 72 hours, as if the caves were somehow preparing for new arrivals. But Vasquez's research had uncovered something far more disturbing than mysterious sounds. The cave systems where people disappeared weren't connected by underground rivers or shared geological formations. They were separated by hundreds of miles of solid bedrock, with no possible physical connection between them. Yet thermal imaging showed identical temperature patterns in all these caves, the same airflow dynamics, the same mineral compositions in their walls. It was as if they were all parts of the same enormous structure, one that existed in ways that traditional geology couldn't explain. Vasquez had been trying to get funding for a comprehensive study when Dakari's video appeared online. Within hours of seeing the footage, she was driving toward Utah with a team of graduate students and enough spelunking equipment to explore miles of tunnel systems. She reached Paria Canyon 18 hours before the concrete barriers were installed, just in time to witness something that would end her career in academia. The Devil's Throat Cave opening had changed again. Instead of the 18-inch gap that Dakari had squeezed through, the entrance now measured 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. The smooth, polished edges that had characterized the original opening were gone, replaced by rough stone that looked freshly broken. But the most disturbing change was inside the cave itself. Using ground-penetrating radar, Vasquez's team mapped a tunnel system that bore no resemblance to what the rescue teams had explored just days earlier. The vertical shaft that had dropped 40 feet straight down was now a gentle slope descending at a 20-degree angle. The horizontal tunnel that had required crawling was now tall enough to walk through upright. The three-way branch that had, if defined the cave's layout, had been replaced by a single passage that continued straight ahead for over 2,000 feet before the radar lost signal. "It's like the cave is rebuilding itself," Vasquez told her team as they prepared to enter. "Every time someone goes missing, the layout changes to accommodate more visitors." The expedition that followed lasted exactly 47 minutes, the same duration as Dakari's initial descent. Vasquez and her 3 graduate students entered Devil's Throat Cave at 4:15 p.m. on October 25, 2021, carrying enough equipment to document every aspect of the changed tunnel system. Their radio contact with the surface team continued for 31 minutes, providing a running commentary of increasingly impossible discoveries. The tunnel walls weren't made of sandstone anymore. They were composed of a black material that it felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The air inside the cave carried scents that had no business existing underground: ocean salt, pine forests, flowers that only bloomed in tropical climates. The temperature remained constant at exactly 72 degrees despite the desert heat outside. Most disturbing of all were the sounds coming from deeper in the cave system. "There's something moving down here," Vasquez radioed at the 28-minute mark. "Multiple somethings. I can hear footsteps, but they're not in sync with our team. It sounds like there are dozens of people walking through passages we can't see." The final radio transmission came at 4:46 p.m., just as Vasquez and her team reached what should have been the end of the mapped tunnel system. Instead, they found themselves standing at the edge of a vast underground space that their equipment couldn't fully measure. "This isn't possible," Vasquez's voice crackled through the radio, filled with wonder and terror. "We're looking at a cavern that has to be at least half a mile across. There are structures down here, buildings or formations that look almost architectural, and there are lights moving in the distance, like there's an entire city underground." That was the last anyone heard from Dr. Elena Vasquez or her graduate students. The surface team waited until midnight before calling for another rescue operation, but this time the authorities were ready. Instead of sending in more people to disappear, they brought industrial equipment and enough concrete to seal the cave opening forever. The work began at dawn on October 26th and continued for 6 days, creating a barrier 8 feet thick that would take specialized equipment to remove. But sealing Devil's Throat Cave didn't stop what had already been set in motion. The 47 people who had downloaded Dakari's final video began arriving in Paria Canyon within days of the sealing operation. They came from across the country, drawn by footage that showed something no one had ever filmed before. Most of them were content creators themselves, people who understood that Dakari had discovered the ultimate viral location and were determined to find their own way inside. They didn't know that the cave system extended far beyond the sealed entrance. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed over 30 additional openings scattered throughout the canyon system, some of them miles from the main entrance. These secondary openings were smaller, harder to find, and required technical climbing skills to reach. But for experienced urban explorers, they represented exactly the kind of challenge that made careers. Marcus Webb was the first to find one of these hidden entrances, a crack in the canyon wall 200 feet above the main trail that required rope work to access. Webb had built his Instagram following by finding abandoned places that others couldn't reach, and the crack led to a tunnel system that exceeded his wildest expectations. His final Instagram post, uploaded automatically from his phone 6 hours after he entered the crack, showed him standing in the same vast underground chamber that Dakari had filmed, but Webb's footage revealed details that Dakari's video had missed. The chamber wasn't empty. Scattered across the stone floor were dozens of backpacks, cameras, and pieces of equipment that looked like they'd been arranged in careful patterns. Webb's camera captured familiar logos, GoPro cases, hiking boots, water bottles with university stickers that matched the gear Dr. Vasquez's team had been carrying. It was as if everything that had ever been brought into the cave system was being collected and displayed like trophies. But the most chilling detail in Webb's footage was in the background, barely visible in the dim light from his camera. Moving among the scattered equipment were human figures, walking with the careful, deliberate movements of people exploring an unfamiliar space. They were too far away to identify, but their silhouettes were unmistakably human. The figures were carrying cameras. Webb's final words, recorded as he approached the collection of abandoned equipment, were whispered so quietly they were almost inaudible. "They're all still here. Everyone who ever came down here is still filming. And now they're filming me." The video ended abruptly, but Webb's phone continued transmitting GPS coordinates for another 12 hours, showing his location moving through spaces that didn't exist on any geological survey. The coordinates traced impossible paths through solid rock, describing loops and spirals that covered over 40 miles of underground distance in spaces that radar showed as empty stone. Webb's disappearance triggered a federal investigation that classified Devil's Throat Cave and the entire surrounding area as a restricted zone. The official explanation cited unstable geological conditions and the discovery of rare archaeological artifacts that required protection. But the real reason was that thermal imaging satellites had detected something that made government geologists recommend immediate and permanent closure of the entire canyon system. The underground network was growing. Every time someone entered the cave system, new passages appeared on satellite imagery. The network was expanding like a living organism, sending tendrils through solid bedrock to connect with other cave systems hundreds of miles away. The expansion followed a pattern that suggested intelligence, systematically linking sites where people had disappeared across the entire Southwest. By December 2021, the connected network stretched from Utah to New Mexico, with nodes in Arizona and Colorado that pulsed with the same thermal signatures as Devil's Throat Cave. Each node was characterized by the same acoustic anomalies Dr. Vasquez had studied, the same impossible architectural features, the same tendency to reconfigure itself after each disappearance. The network was building something, using the people who entered it as raw material for a construction project that spanned multiple states and reached depths that no conventional drilling equipment could measure. But the most terrifying discovery came from analysis of seismic data collected during the cave's active period. The vibrations detected by monitoring stations weren't random geological activity. They were rhythmic, purposeful, organized into patterns that resembled communication between different parts of the network. The caves were talking to each other, and according to the final classified report filed by the Department of Interior, they were talking about surface expansion plans that included populated areas across the Southwest. The network wasn't content to remain underground. It was preparing to emerge. That's why Devil's Throat Cave had to be sealed forever, buried under tons of concrete that will take centuries to erode. Because some spaces aren't meant to be explored, and some content isn't meant to go viral. And because somewhere in the darkness beneath the American Southwest, an entire network of content creators is still filming, documenting the construction of something that was never meant to exist on the surface world. The last thermal signature detected from the Devil's Throat network was recorded on New Year's Eve 2021. It showed dozens of heat sources moving through the connected tunnel systems, all converging on a central location directly beneath the city of Phoenix, Arizona. The signatures were human-shaped, but they moved with perfect coordination, like a single organism controlling multiple bodies. And according to the timestamp on the thermal imaging, they were all carrying active recording equipment. Somewhere beneath Phoenix, Dakari Voss and everyone who followed him into the network are still creating content, but they're not making videos for human audiences anymore.